Hi. Yeah. Well, first of all, I want to say thank you to all of you for hosting Jody and me today, and especially to Dr. Shannon, who arranged the logistics, and also to all the professors who were kind enough to welcome us today. It's been a real pleasure to be on campus and to sit in on various classes. And I should mention with regard to this is for me a very personal topic. In fact, the alternative title that I had mentioned to Dr. Shannon was, you could also call this How Studying Islam Has Strengthened My Faith as a Catholic. Okay? And in a sense, there's been a couple of different ways that working with this material has a very sort of personal backstory. First of all, going back to the early 1980s, when I first began living in different Islamic societies overseas, I should tell you that while I was doing language study over there, in Egypt to begin with, for example, I would make no secret of the fact that I'm a lifelong Catholic. I mean, I didn't go around advertising it, but I can tell you that, when you sit outside at a tea shop and people say, oh, he speaks Arabic, people come up, they'll talk to you. And one thing I love, actually, about living in societies like that is people enjoy recreationally talking about faith, okay? And so they would usually start off people saying, oh, hal anta Muslim, alhamdulillah? Are you a Muslim? Praise be to Allah. And I would say, no, actually, I'm a Christian. And they would say, well, that's too bad, but let's keep talking anyway, And inevitably, what would happen is topics would come up of, this is great. I've got a real live Christian in front of me. So what's this business with three? Because the Quran says, do not say three, with regard to God. So the Trinity would come up, okay? Or what's this about Ibn Allah, son of God? What's that all about, okay? So it's great language practice because if you've never tried thinking through Catholic doctrine in another language, well, it's a good exercise, okay? So in that sense, really, throughout my professional life, okay, what I would find is that things that I grew up with as a cradle Catholic that I'd more or less taken for granted, I say, yes, I believe and so forth, but have you thought it through? Have you thought it through well enough so that you can talk about it, let alone in another language? Just talk about it heart to heart with people who, they may be challenging you, but they're mostly not hostile. They honestly want to know, what does this doctrine mean to you as a Christian, okay? So that's part of what has gone into all this subject. The second thing is this. I've taught courses on Islam for, a long time, and I always say the first day of class, listen, in a sense, you're getting an introduction to the Islamic tradition from an outsider, okay? Because I'm not Muslim. I'm a confessing Catholic Christian. All the places, by the way, where I've been hired, okay, where I've taught over the years, in the United States, the other finalists for the jobs were all Muslim, And so I had to make a pitch why it was worthwhile to hire a non-Muslim to teach Islamic studies. And one of the things that would get argued about among the search committee members is, well, maybe David can work as a kind of bridge. So in other words, what you have to do is you're working between different cultures, different faiths, etc. So knowing that, okay, I'm not a Muslim, but I'm, introducing students, most of whom are from the Christian background, but often only very, very loosely. They scarcely know the Christian tradition, let alone some other faith, okay? But knowing all that, one of the things that I would try to do is, in addition to introducing the Islamic faith to students, I would also take them on field trips. So we would go on field trips to observe Islamic worship at mosques, whether Sunni, Shia, Ismaili, Sufi, you name it. We would, go to five or six at least mosques every semester. And I would make all the arrangements in advance, and I would explain the purpose of the courses as academic study, etc. However, there would be consistently a challenge as follows. The imams, the prayer leaders, very hospitable, welcome us warmly, but then proselytize like crazy because they say, whoa, we got a bunch of Ferengis coming in, let's hit them, with the pitch. And one of the main forms of the pitch knowing the loose general faith background of most of my students, inevitably I would hear the imams say things like, you know, one thing, we got a big thing in common already. You revere Jesus, we revere Jesus. There's not really that much difference. And I'd be like, okay. I don't want to get into a public fight with my hosts at the mosque. It's just, there's a certain, basic courtesy. But we would always have a post-expedition, gathering either in the classroom or, to have something to eat together, the students and I. And we would go over, and I would say to the students, you know what, actually, there's a big difference between how Islam and Christianity understand the figure of Jesus Christ. And the book that I wrote, the courses that I've taught, because I've taught for a long time a course specifically about the figure of Jesus in Islam and Christianity, and this presentation come out of that experience, okay? In other words, you can find lots of books on comparative religion that minimize the difference between Islam and Christianity. Myself, I think that's off. That does a disservice to both traditions because although, yes, both traditions are Abrahamic, we'll talk about that, nonetheless, there are radical differences between the two faiths, and I mean no disrespect to either religion when I say that, okay? But real dialogue has to begin from acknowledging the realities that are in front of us, okay? So I say all of that to say that there's a lot at stake in this for me. A lot of my personal background goes into it, and I have to also confess that from time to time, a bit of controversy gets stirred up, but I'd much rather have controversy than people fall asleep, okay? And one thing about my job is it's been a lot of things over the last 40 plus years, but it has never been boring, okay? All right, so with that, let's take a look. What I'm going to do, this is how I tend to proceed with this. There's a lot of material in here, much of which will be unfamiliar to people who are not specialists in comparative religion or Islam. I'll go over this sort of once over lightly. What I like to do is sort of frame the material, but what I enjoy most are the questions. I like discussion, and there will be questions. That much I can guarantee. So let's just take a quick look, and you can really feel free when we get done, any questions you have about any aspect of this, I'm always happy to address and try to tackle. Okay, so what I'd like to begin with is to offer very quickly an overview of the Islamic faith, beginning with the life of the Prophet Muhammad ibn Abdullah, okay, who is revered as the so-called last prophet, okay, of Islam. In order to understand the career of the Prophet Muhammad and what's called the revelation of the Quran, you need to know about the faith tradition he was born into, because Muhammad was not raised as a Muslim, okay, right? Just as if you're studying, for example, Buddhism, okay, and you want to know something about the life of Siddhartha Gautama, okay, you need to know something about the Hindu tradition because Hinduism was the religion that Siddhartha was raised in. By the same token, when you study Christianity, you need to know something about the Jewish faith because it was the Jewish tradition that Jesus comes out of. By the same token, what was the faith that Muhammad was raised in? It's known as the Jahiliyyah. It's a term, it's an Arabic term that appears in the Quran. It's fairly derogatory, actually. It's rather a negative term. It comes from the root jahl, which means to be ignorant. Jahiliyyah, usually referred to as the age of ignorance, okay? And that's a word that's used, including by English-speaking Muslims today, to refer to the religion, the society, the ethics, the values of the pre-Islamic Arabs of the Arabian Peninsula, okay, where Muhammad himself grew up, okay? You can see his dates there. So he was born in the 6th century AD, dies in the year 632. Okay, the way I like to introduce the Jahiliyyah tradition to students, I talk about what's known as the three dimensions of the Jahiliyyah: the desert, the urban, and the Abrahamic, okay? And this is just like a really quick schema. I'll just say something very briefly about what I call the desert dimension of the Jahiliyyah, of pre-Islamic Arabian society. First thing you need to know is that with regard to the desert dimension, the most traditional aspect of the Jahiliyyah, We're talking about a society in which there was no centralized government, no police force, no social security network at all, except the family, the extended family known as the clan. Clans grouped together to form tribes. All right? Each of these tribes are often engaged in fights for survival against each other because of a scarcity mentality. There was never enough to go around. All right? The social structure. Each of the tribes has what's called the sheikh. Sheikh just basically means old man. The idea is that if you manage somehow in that environment to live to the staggeringly old age of, say, 35, you must be wise, okay? All right? So the sheikh, the old man, runs the tribe. How does the sheikh govern? In accordance with what's called the sunnah. Sunnah means exemplary ancestral custom, okay? That's actually a very important word, okay? The term sunnah, ancestral custom, there's a famous poem from the Jahiliyyah where the poet says, "For after all, every tribe has its own sunnah according to which that tribe is governed." So in the time that Muhammad was growing up, you have a scarcity mentality of a number of tribes pitted against each other. They each have their own sunnah, or exemplary custom, that you're supposed to follow. You hear the word sunnah, and if you know anything about contemporary politics in the Muslim world, you may have heard that word before, because there are two major denominations in Islam. Does anyone know what they are? Yes, ma'am. That's right, the Shia and the Sunni, okay? And the word Sunni comes from that word sunnah. The idea is that if you belong, about 85% of the world's Muslims today are Sunni, okay? And they take their name from this notion. To be a Muslim is to follow the sunnah of one person. That's Muhammad, okay? So no longer do you have tribes, each with their own sunnah. Ideally, you've got one sunnah. And that's the exemplary custom of the lifestyle of Muhammad, okay? And what characterizes these tribes is what's called asabiyya, group loyalty. The pre-Islamic period, the identity is collective. The emphasis is not on the individual, it's on the tribe. That's where you place your loyalty. What's interesting is that it's always worth knowing a little bit about religious beliefs of the Jahiliyyah. I've talked some about the social structure. What's important to know is that in pre-Islamic Arabia, there was a belief in the afterlife. There was an afterlife that people believed in, but it was nothing to look forward to, because the idea is that when we die, we all go to the same shadowy underworld. Whether you're good or you're bad, everyone winds up in the dark, underground, as a kind of strengthless wraith phantom figure. If you've read the Gilgamesh epic, it sounds a little bit like that, or the ancient Hebrew concept of Sheol, okay? Very, very similar, okay? And in that case, if the afterlife is not something very much to look forward to, what was the real immortality? The real immortality, from the Jahiliyyah point of view, was to be remembered, to have a reputation. And how is that reputation achieved? By doing a deed on behalf of your tribe that's worthy of a poem, okay? Because every tribe would have poets who would recite, create, extemporize, and then memorize poems about glorious deeds done by tribal members, okay? Keep that in mind, because some of this will come back as we look in closer detail. Whoops, here. Let's try that again. And let's see, okay, good. All right, so Jahiliyyah religion is polytheistic, okay? Animistic, that is with emphasis on the belief of local territorial spirits that inhabit the landscape, okay? It's non-creedal, okay? You may or may not be aware of the fact that I would say in the world's history, the vast majority of religions that have existed have been non-creedal, okay? Which means, okay, for example, famous religion that is creedal, of course, is Christianity. Islam is also creedal, okay? But most of the world's religions historically have been non-creedal. Religions that are non-creedal then define themselves not on basis of belief, but on the basis of ritual, okay? You show up for the ritual, and believe whatever you want to about it. Okay? All right. I'll also mention here that there was a widespread belief in the Jahiliyyah, which continues until today, in local animistic territorial spirits known as the jinn. Okay? What's interesting is that belief in the jinn is one aspect among several from the Jahiliyyah that continue right up to today. In fact, chapter 72 of the Quran is called the jinn. Okay? So that's a whole topic in itself, actually. Absolutely fascinating. Okay? And I've had the, I guess you could call it the privilege in, while I was living in Pakistan, I actually interviewed 3 different sorcerers who made a good living exorcising jinns. Okay, that's really, really some interesting side stories there. The reason I mention it is this. The Jahiliyyah people, okay, very much concerned with religion. And it was not a question of whether or not they believed in God or gods. Widespread religious belief. The operative question, and I think really it's a question that sort of rings existentially across the ages. The question is not whether God or gods exist. The operative question is, do they care about us? Do they care about us? And to understand the success of Islam in its own original setting, you want to keep that question in mind. Okay. All right. So we just talked a little bit about the most traditional aspect of the Jahiliyyah. It's called the desert dimension. Then there's what I call the urban dimension. And that is to say that although most of the population was intensely rural, living in the desert, there were 2 major urban centers at that time in the Jahiliyyah during the time that Muhammad was growing up in the 6th century AD. One was known as Yathrib. It later became known as Medinat an-Nabi, or the city of the Prophet, Medina. More important for our purposes is the second city in Arabia called Mecca. Okay? Both of them near the coast. And Mecca was Muhammad's hometown. Muhammad belonged to a tribe called the Quraysh. The Quraysh were probably the most influential and wealthy of the tribes that lived in Mecca. Mecca, during the time that Muhammad grew up, was important for 2 things in particular: pilgrimage and business. Okay? And even during the time that Muhammad was a child, Mecca was a pilgrimage city with its own major shrine, and that shrine was called the Kaaba. If you know anything about Islam, you've probably heard of the Kaaba. What many people don't realize is that the Kaaba pre-existed Muhammad by centuries. During the time Muhammad was growing up, the Arab tradition says that the Kaaba was surrounded by a circle of 360 idols. Okay? The primary deity worshipped there was a god called Allah, or El-Ilah El-Akbar, or the great God, known for short as Allah. Okay? Allah was associated with creation, with the sky, and with rainfall. In other words, Muhammad did not introduce the worship of Allah. Muhammad did not introduce the worship of Allah. What he did was to modify traditional belief. If you were a political scientist and you wanted a quick 1 or 2 sentence summary of what Muhammad accomplished, it was to take the warring tribes of the Arabian Peninsula who had been in conflict with each other, select one particular deity for all of them to focus on, and then turn that energy outward. You with me? Okay? All right? And then you might say, well, why Allah when there's hundreds of others to choose from? Well, think about it. Okay? If you want to unite people and no longer limit their beliefs geographically, say focusing on the jinns that are all territorial, why not a god who is sky god, associated with rainfall, right? Associated with creation, okay? Right? Again, that's from a political scientist hat on, right? Okay, but just to kind of give you some idea of that. All right, and one of Allah's titles was Lord of the Kaaba. Okay, good. All right, and then in case you've never seen photos of it, just a few pictures of the Kaaba. By the way, this is one place I've never visited. You may be aware of the fact that Mecca, along with Medina, they're called the Haramain, the forbidden cities, okay? Which means I have not been there, okay? All right. But it is as you can see, During the time of the Hajj, the pilgrimage season, you'll have a couple of million people there at a time. Okay, third dimension of the Jahiliyyah. We just mentioned very briefly the desert dimension and the urban dimension. The third is what I call the Abrahamic dimension. Okay, that is to say that there was a minority population of Jews and Christians living in the Arabian Peninsula, okay, during the time that Muhammad was growing up. This photo right here, by the way, is from an archaeological site at Petra. You've heard of Petra? Okay. If you've seen the Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, okay, right? I actually worked there years ago as a volunteer digger. That's a whole story in itself. This is one of the monuments there from Petra, dates to the Nabatean period. It's called a deir today in modern Arabic, which means the monastery, because of the fact that during the Jahiliyyah, Christian monks lived there. There are a number of abandoned ruins in Egypt and so forth in the Middle East that in late antiquity were inhabited by Christian monks. This is one of them, okay? And based on my reading of chapter 7 of the Quran, there's evidence to suggest that Muhammad visited this particular place, but that's another story. Okay, all right. Okay, now, Muhammad himself, he's from the tribe of the Quraysh, okay, born in Mecca, grows up in the Jahiliyyah pagan tradition. The way he made his living as a young man, okay, was as a merchant who traveled extensively. Another way to read the Quran is just in terms of geographical references, and on the base of those geographic references, I would say that Muhammad probably traveled as far south as Yemen and Oman, and up north into the Byzantine Empire, into places like Jordan, for example, probably Syria. This is all before he discovers his vocation, all right? But this is what I want to emphasize here. According to the early Islamic sources themselves, while he was traveling as a young man, before he became a prophet, Muhammad had extensive contact with Jews and Christians, was sometimes offered hospitality for the night by Christian monks in places like you just saw, all right? And according to the Muslim sources, had conversations with rabbis and Christian monks about religious topics, okay? This is all worth knowing, I think, okay? All right. Now, according to Islamic tradition, in the year 610, when he's 40 years old, Muhammad receives what's called the da'wah. Da'wah in modern Arabic means like an invitation like, socialize, but it also in classical Arabic means to summon someone, to issue a summons, okay? Now, according to the early biographers in the Islamic tradition, it was his habit, even before he became a prophet, that Muhammad would retire for solitary prayer and meditation whenever he would come back from his business trips. Instead of carousing in town, he would go off to a cave in Mount Hira. You can see the picture there, right? So on the outskirts of Mecca for solitary meditation, all right? And it's there, when he was 40 years old, that he has this important encounter. And you can see Mount Hira there in the photograph. Okay, this is the entrance to the cave, okay? And what happens is, while he's praying by himself, he's approached by a stranger whom Muhammad finds quite frightening and intimidating. And the stranger comes up to him and says, "Iqra," which means recite. Muhammad says, "Recite what? What do I say?" And he says again, "Iqra," recite. I say what? The third time he says, "Iqra," recite. And then says, "Say what?" And then the stranger says to him, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insan min alaq, iqra wa rabbuka al-akram alladhi allama al-insan ma lam ya'lam." Recite, recite in the name of your Lord who created mankind from a drop of blood. Okay? And it's from that you get the name of the scripture. Iqra is the imperative, the word to recite, and from it you get Quran, which means recitation. By the way, if you listen to that, Iqra bismi rabbuka alladhi khalaq, khalaqa al-insan min alaq, you can hear the rhyme. The rhyme style is called saj'a, okay? Saj'a is a form of Jahiliya poetry that's used for incantations, okay? And Sajat, by the way, literally means pigeon cooing, because to the early Arab ear, it's like pigeon cooing, okay? Sajat. Arabic is fun, by the way. Okay. Okay, so Muhammad preaches the Quran in his hometown, but is rejected by most of his Jahiliya neighbors. Because of that rejection, ultimately what happens in the year 622, rejected by his neighbors in Mecca, Muhammad moves northward to the city of Medina, about 280 miles north of Mecca. And it is in Medina, okay, after undertaking the Hijrah, the Exodus, that Muhammad establishes what's called the Ummah, the community of the faithful. And what's interesting is that it's after he moves from Mecca to Medina and establishes the Ummah, the community of believers, you can sense a sort of shift in tone. Now, in the revelations, the early Meccan revelations from 610 to 622, those, I'm generalizing here, those tend to be more universalist in tone. The Medinan revelations, the verses of the Quran that date from 622 until shortly before his death in 632, those are the ones that require a more confrontational tone, let's put it that way. Because it is in Medina that the open military conflict breaks out. If you've heard any terms in Arabic, you've probably heard the term jihad. Okay? Jihad comes from, is an Arabic word that simply means to struggle, to strive. It occurs in the phrase jihad fi sabilillah, or struggle in the path of Allah. You hear that frequently in the Quran. However, right from the beginning, in Muhammad's time in Medina, you can see that it has a sense of physical warfare against enemies of the faith, some of whom are kafirs or kuffar, infidels, pagans, but also against those Jews and Christians who would not accept the suzerainty, the political control by Muhammad. Okay? Year 630, Muhammad conquers his hometown of Mecca. He purifies the Kaaba. It's very interesting. The Kaaba was not destroyed. He had the circle of idols destroyed, but he had the Kaaba remain, justifying it by saying that the Kaaba had been built by Abraham with the assistance of his son Ishmael. Interesting story to that as well. All right? Okay. And shortly before he dies, after the conquest of Mecca, Muhammad begins the jihad campaign against his neighbors in the Byzantine Christian Empire. Okay, and I just include this here just to let you know that one has to acknowledge also that we're not talking about a pacifist campaign, okay? In fact, the Islamic tradition itself acknowledges the violent dimension in Muhammad's life. That was not something that was covered up or something like that. Okay, so now let's talk a little bit about doctrine, okay? And you may have heard before what's called the Shahada, the testimony of faith. I mentioned before that Islam, like Christianity, is a creedal religion, but the creed, if you want to call it that, in Islam is much shorter. Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. I testify there is no God except Allah, and Muhammad is his messenger. Okay? So there's two basic parts, summarized in Arabic under the terms Tawheed and Nubuwah. Tawheed means the assertion of oneness. Okay? From the point of view of Islam, Christianity and Judaism are both defective in their monotheism. The assertion of Islam is an assertion of the purification of the notion of Tawheed, or God's oneness. I'll come back to that in just a minute. The second half is the notion of prophethood, okay? And that is extraordinarily important to Islam and central also to the creed of Muhammad. Okay, now, what I want to do is to sort of unpack those doctrines for you, okay, and then use that to lead into how Islam understands the figure of Jesus Christ, okay? right from the earliest Meccan revelations, there's an assertion that human nature is characterized by our tendency to transgress, to be disobedient, and to be forgetful of our obligations to Allah. Okay? The remedy for that is Islam. Islam is, the basic meaning of Islam is to submit or to surrender, okay? Submit to Allah, submit to the divine revolution, okay? And I'll just mention here that that word Islam, to submit or to surrender, okay, is cognate to or related to the word salam, okay? And what does the term salam mean? Peace, that's right. And it's cognate with the Hebrew word shalom, okay? So in Hebrew you say shalom aleichem, right? In Arabic, assalamu alaikum, okay? Peace be with you, okay? So you're in a Muslim country, right? Someone says to you, assalamu alaikum, you know? And if you're upright, you're going to say, wa alaikum assalam, and upon you be peace, okay? Or if you want to get more extensive, wa alaikum assalam, wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh, and upon you be peace and Allah's grace and blessings. And then in colloquial Arabic, what kids like to do is to fool around a bit, and they'll say, wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullah wa barakatuh wa izakan ma'ak shilin hatu, which means upon you be peace and Allah's mercy and blessings. And if you've got a nickel, throw that in too, right? Anyways, it rhymes. Okay, good. So one thing that's very important to know, and this is one of a number of points that Islam shares in common with Christianity, is the notion of personal accountability. In other words, whereas in the Jahiliyyah there was a notion that good and bad alike go to the same vaguely depressing underworld shadow existence, Islam has the notion of individual accountability. It doesn't matter what tribe you belong to. The collective is not being emphasized as much now. Instead, an emphasis on the personal, the idea also that there's a belief in a hell of punishments and a heaven, paradise of reward. Okay? Now, given the fact that we tend to be not only transgressive, but forgetful of our obligations, that's where the concept of prophethood comes in. Islam, the Islamic tradition teaches that there have been thousands of prophets, countless numbers of prophets who have come throughout human history. Okay? It's known as Silsil al-Anbiya, or the chain, the sequence of the prophets. They're all preaching the same thing. Tawheed, God's oneness, and the need to submit, Islam. Okay? And what's interesting here is the question, what's the world's oldest religion? Right? From the point of view of the Muslim faith, the world's oldest faith is Islam, because there have been Muslims for as long as there have been people trying to submit to Allah. In other words, Islam is the root. In Arabic, the mu prefix can be used to mean someone who undertakes the activity associated with the verbal root. Got it? So a Muslim is just someone who submits to Allah. I don't know if you've ever heard the term mujahideen, okay, right? That's just someone who undertakes jihad, okay, that kind of thing. You've heard the term mufti. A mufti is someone who issues a fatwa or a religious decree. Okay. I don't want to turn this into an Arabic lesson. I apologize. All right, good. But this is directly relevant because of the fact that it has to do with how Judaism and Christianity are understood in Islam. In other words, if Islam is the world's oldest religion, and there has been a chain of prophets, a sequence of prophets, all preaching the same Tawhidic Muslim message, when you read the Quran, you will come across figures who are familiar from the Bible, including Abraham, including Noah, including Moses, and including Jesus Christ, all of whom are viewed with reverence in Islam as authentic Muslim messengers of Allah, preaching the same Tawhidic message of monotheism and submission to Allah. Okay. And what's interesting is that there's actually a tradition of veneration reflected in Islamic art. Okay? Many people think of Islamic art as aniconic, no images. That's only partially true. Okay? That's a whole side story in itself. Okay? But I'll just reference that very, very briefly. Okay. Now, just to summarize the comparison of Islamic and Christian teachings, okay? Let's talk a little bit about what they share in common, first of all, right? First of all, the notion of monotheism, the notion of a God who is just and merciful, very different from the Jahiliyyah, pagan, pre-Islamic notion of these jinns, for example, that are so capricious and unpredictable, okay? Islam also shares with the Christian faith the notion of a scripture, okay, a sacred text, okay? The notion of prophethood is also something that is shared in common. The notion of community, that we're responsible for helping one another, and also the notion of martyrdom, okay, to give witness to one's faith. There are also certain basic ways in which the traditions differ, okay? One thing that you'll note, and again, I'm generalizing here, there's certain ways in which you can talk about exceptions and so forth, but just to paint with some broad brushstrokes for a moment, okay? Especially in the Sunni tradition, if I had time to talk about the Shias, I'd have to modify this more, but to generalize, you can certainly say that Islam is a religion linked to success in this world, following the model of Muhammad, okay, who was a political and military success in his own lifetime, okay, which has influenced the shape of the religion ever since then, okay? Another thing to note is that it's very clear in Islamic doctrine, Judaism and Christianity are regarded as superior to paganism, okay, to the Jahiliyyah, but regarded as inferior to Islam. Why? Because of the fact that their beliefs have become corrupt and distorted over time, okay? In other words, when you see references to Judaism in the Quran, okay, Moses is regarded as an authentic Muslim prophet, okay, who preached to the Israelites. And at first they were okay. But then the Quran references the golden calf story, okay, that indicates the Muslim Israelites falling away from the Islamic message of Moses and becoming Jews, okay? So God had to send another prophet, another Muslim prophet, Jesus Christ. And the apostles are referred to, not by name, but the apostles are mentioned in the Quran, okay? And all was good for a while, okay? Jesus, Muslim messenger, preaching Islam. But then what happens? The Christians get into this thing about Trinitarianism, right? They degenerate into Christians. So one final message was needed, okay? And that's Muhammad, the last messenger, okay? All right. Also, in terms of differences, okay, and this, again, is drawing on my own experience with the field trips I mentioned to you before and so forth. Islam, okay, the Quran mentions Jesus close to 100 times in the Quran. It mentions him with reverence as a prophet of Allah, son of the Blessed Virgin Mary, okay? But on the other hand, Islam denies that Jesus is the Son of God. It denies that he died on the cross, okay? Very important from my point of view, the Quran never makes reference to any suffering of Jesus or Christ's passion on our behalf. It denies that he rose from the dead, and it denies the reality of the Trinity, okay? All right, and then now let's take it from the point of view of Christian belief, points of distinction here. I would say, again, I'm generalizing, where Islam puts a lot of emphasis on God's power and majesty, Christianity puts more emphasis on the love that God has for us, okay? Reflected, for example, in John 3:16. Students here will be familiar with this, okay? All right? Christianity does not emphasize political or social success as an index of its truth the way that you have with regard to Muhammad's political and military success in his lifetime, okay? Notion of martyrdom exists in both faiths, but the career, if you want to call it that, of Jesus and Muhammad, radically different. You'll remember that Christ says, put up your sword. Remember, he says, do you not know that if I wanted to, I could call on 12 legions of angels to come to my aid? Okay? All right. And of course, Christians, unlike Muslims, believe that Jesus, in fact, did die on the cross and for the purpose of the forgiveness of our sins. Okay? Number 5 there emphasizes what I call the kenotic dimension, the self-emptying dimension of what Christ did in undertaking his voluntary suffering. Okay? And that suffering linked to the voluntary nature of what Christ underwent is both meaningful and salvific. Okay? And one thing that I always like to emphasize in talking with my students about this is the fact that the notion of Christ's suffering is important, not simply from a doctrinal point of view, but for the interior life of each of us personally. When I talk with my students, sometimes with the undergraduates, I've sometimes had people say to me, all this talk of yours about suffering, 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 pain, pain, pain. I've got a pretty good life. I mean, things are going pretty well. I'm comfortable. My parents love me. I'm at a nice school. I'm having a great time with my friends. I got a car of my own, whatever. And I say to them, well, I got 2 words for you. Just wait. And for me, I know that when times are hard, it's good to know, tremendous comfort. Whatever we go through, Christ has been there before us as a pioneer in suffering. Okay? And that leads, of course, also to the notion of the Via Crucis, which will be familiar to students here, I think. Okay? And then just to kind of add to this a little bit, as a Catholic, the notion of the Eucharistic devotion to Christ is something that's tremendously important to me. And I think that there are lessons that we can apply from all this, okay? Also just in terms of the Eucharist. First of all, that this kind of comparative study, for me, has had the benefit of reminding us that the Christ present before us in the Eucharist, okay, is a God-made man who truly suffered. As I mentioned, the Quran, although it mentions Jesus with reference, never makes reference to his suffering. And then we can feel assured that whatever sorrows we go through, we share with Christ in prayer. He'll understand because he's been through it. He has existed. His presence is still here with us in this valley of tears. And finally, also something very significant to me, right? You remember from the conclusion of the Gospel of John, okay? That the risen Christ still today bears the marks of the cross, okay? He'll never forget what it's like to be human because he carries the scars of suffering for all eternity, okay? That's very, very distinctive to the Christian tradition, okay? And last, a little bit of advertising there. If you're interested, this is, what I just talked about is a very, very quick conspectus, but I go into this in a lot more detail in that book. So I'll stop here, and any questions you have, I'll be happy to take. Right. Thank you. Yes, sir.
Could you talk more about, when you were saying about the purification of God as one in Islam?
Yeah. So in other words, purification in the sense of correction. Tashih is what they call it in Arabic. That is that there are various traditions or legends in Islam about how many prophets have there been in human history. Some say 124,000, some say 144,000, but anyways, a lot of them, okay? Why the need for so many, right? And the answer from the Islamic tradition's point of view is because we humans are such stumble bums, we keep messing up the basic belief, okay? So we keep corrupting the message because we're so forgetful. So the message has to keep constantly being purified. So, Judaism and Christianity are regarded as better than Jahiliyyah paganism, but they had to be purified because they fell into corruption, symbolized, as a kind of shorthand, symbolized A by the golden calf and B by Trinitarianism. Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
Could you speak to the question, I feel like I should know this, but I'd like to, hear you speak on this. Could you speak to the question about whether or not the Catholic Church considers Allah to be the real God? This is a question I get from students all the time.
Yeah, and that's always a question that's worth asking, and and it stirs up a wonderful doctrinal hornet's nest too, I find. Yeah. So, if you think of Nostra Aetate, for example, I think that the Church, to its credit, wants to enter into constructive dialogue with other faiths. Okay. So I've talked to Catholic priests and theologians about this, and as well as, of course, to Muslims, in various settings, throughout the world. And if I were to summarize, I would say we're worshiping the same deity, but the understanding of that deity is radically different, okay? And so what I have found in my career is that what I want to do is, wherever possible, to meet people on common ground if I can, but without compromising the integrity of either faith, okay? And at the same time, without provoking needless hostility, okay? And so what I will tend to do, because I've actually given presentations, I remember doing a couple of presentations at the University of Peshawar. That's in the northwest frontier province in Pakistan, near right where the tribal areas begin as you get to Afghanistan. This was shortly after September 11th, okay? That was a tough audience. You guys are great. First of all, as far as I know, nobody came in here armed, But anyways, I remember the head of the history department there was the person who invited me, and the topic I was assigned was a comparative history of the Sunni and Shia traditions. Okay, because Peshawar is a city in Pakistan that's been torn apart over that. I mean, literally, And when I got done talking, and I thought I did a pretty good job of sort of like summarizing the differences and expressing some hope about reconciliation. And when I got done, the first question I got asked from the audience was, the person stood up and said, for a Christian, it sounds like you know a fair amount about Islam. So could you answer this question for me? The Sunnis and the Shias, which of them is right and which of them is wrong? Right? So it's like, guys, I've just spent an hour and a half, trying to find bridges and stuff like that. So, which is another way of saying that there's no way of pleasing anybody with, with a question like that. So I mean, my short answer is, I think that ultimately, when you talk about Allah, talk about Christian worship, we're worshiping, as a monotheist, I believe we're worshiping the same God, but their understanding is radically different, and it has consequences.
Right. So when we say the Jews definitely are worshiping our God, but whereas the Muslims, their understanding of God is so different, although it is the same.
Yeah, I think there's, now having said that, I've lived in Muslim societies enough that I can say with confidence that I've met lots of devout Muslims who I feel are, living lives of true piety, and it's not for me to judge whether they're going to heaven or not, But I do think that Allah is that God is going to recognize their sincerity. Yes, sir.
So I have a question about the Trinity and multiplicity within God found in Islam as well. In some recent endeavors to learn more about Islam for apologetic reasons, I found at least one example of, Muslims will say that God is one, Allah is one, and uncreated, and they'll say that the Quran, or the Word of God at least, is also one and uncreated.
Yeah.
So that within it already shows a multiplicity within God. And so I was wondering if you have any more information about that, and if you could say just a little bit more about that.
Yes, and actually, I don't know if the campus library has this or not, but I do discuss this in the book. So oh, do you? Oh, very happy to hear that. Very happy to hear that. Good, right, good. Yeah, yeah. So here's the interesting thing. When you do comparative theology, Islam and Christianity, the real parallel to Jesus Christ, the Christian Jesus Christ, the real parallel to the Christian understanding of Jesus Christ in Islam is not Muhammad, it's the Quran. Okay? Because of the fact that, just to pick up on exactly your very good insight, right? Because Christians believe that Jesus is the eternal, uncreated Word of God. Okay? Muslims believe that the Quran is the eternal, uncreated Word of Allah. Okay? And in fact, historically, one of the main theological controversies dividing Muslims in the 9th century, with ripple effects afterwards, is the question of whether or not the Quran is created or uncreated. Okay? And there was a time when the caliphate itself, you've heard the caliphs, right? Okay. There was a time when the caliphate itself tried to insist that the Quran was created because it sounded like compromising Allah's unicity, like we're sliding into Christianity now. Okay? But ultimately, popular reverence for the Quran, right? Popular reverence for the Quran was such that they demanded the notion of the uncreatedness. And so to this day, that's the majoritarian opinion. Okay? Does that help? Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I haven't had a chance to read the Quran.
I'm sorry?
I haven't had a chance to read the Quran.
Oh, yeah, that's okay.
Um,
It's not a quick read.
yeah. So you mentioned that Christ does not mention his passion in the Quran. Does it mention how he died at all, or is it just
Yes, excellent question. Did everyone hear the question? Okay, so the question that you asked was, does the Quran say anything about Jesus' death? Right, okay. By the way, just a quick question. Has anyone studied this enough to have heard?
Don't they believe that he was replaced by a substitute, not a living person, but as a substitute, that was the person who was crucified and Jesus was taken up full body into heaven?
Yeah, this is complicated, okay? The Quran says, وَلَكِنْ شُبَّهَ لَهُمْ with regard to the crucifixion. It was made to appear so to them. This is something that in intro lectures I never bring up unless someone asks, right? Because it gets complicated, all right? The crucifixion is referred to only to refute it, okay? So it says they did not kill him, nor did they crucify him, but so it was made to appear to them. It looked as if he was crucified, but he wasn't really crucified. That's what the Quran says, okay? And then the logical question is, well, what does that mean, right? Okay, but the Quran says that Allah raised Jesus up to himself. Jesus never died, okay? Now, if you were to look at what's the history behind that, okay? As a non-Muslim student of Islam, I feel free to investigate that, okay? So here's my shorthand thing, response to this. You guys have heard of Gnosticism? Okay. Can anyone offer a quick definition of Gnosticism? Yes, ma'am.
Salvation by knowledge, like if you know the right things, then you have that. And one early Gnostic sect did teach that Simon of Cyrene was crucified instead of Christ, and Christ was caught up to heaven and laughed at how stupid we all were. Yeah. There's actually a book by John Dart, I think it's called The Laughing Savior, which summarizes some of these Gnostic beliefs. In other words, one of the things that I do in my crucifix book is to look at the intellectual and spiritual landscape of the Near East during the time that Muhammad was growing up. And Gnostic beliefs survived in the Near East till at least the 10th century, okay? So what I posit is that notions of this alternative idea about the crucifixion, it's called the docetic crucifixion? Yeah, okay, docetic, D-O-C-E-T-I-C. It comes from the Greek word dokeo, which means to seem or to appear.
So there were Gnostics who believed that it only seemed as if Christ was crucified, but he wasn't really. Okay, that was like part of the cultural atmosphere in the Jahiliyyah, if you like. Okay, so now the question is, we know that Muhammad, in his youth, spoke with Jews and Christians. So he was apparently, this is my theory, he was apparently exposed to two different Christologies about the crucifixion. One you could call the Orthodox, and the other the docetic Gnostic. Okay? And then the question is, why did he choose one and not the other? Now, if you're a pious conservative Muslim, you would say it wasn't his choosing. Allah told him through the angel Gabriel, right? But I'm not a Muslim, so I don't have to accept that. Okay? You with me? All right? And here's the thing. I already said to you that Islam places a lot more emphasis on worldly success. Okay? Also, Quran interpretation says that every verse of the Quran was intended not only sub specie eternitatis, for all eternity, but also to comfort Muhammad personally in the trials he was going through. So my question is, which would be more comfort to him? Knowing that his predecessor was nailed to a cross and publicly humiliated, or that he actually escaped his tormentors and was raised by Allah to heaven? That's my theory for why I think that the Quran features a docetic crucifixion. Okay, in a nutshell. Yeah. Yes, sir.
Thank you so much for visiting today and for your presentation. Is there a space within Islam for a theory of natural law, and historically has there ever been much engagement with the concept of natural law in Islam?
Well, okay, a short answer for this. Okay, that's a wonderful question. Thank you. There has not been that much room for it, I would say, and this has to do. I don't know if you've heard of or are familiar with what's called Asharite theology. So basically, there were movements, especially during the Abbasid Caliphate. I would say, especially in the 8th and 9th centuries, during the dominance of what's called Mu'tazila or Mu'tazilite theology, for more questions. Inquiry into the question of, can we talk about people sort of discovering religion naturally, independent of revelation and so forth? And under the influence of that, the Mu'tazila put a great deal more emphasis on reason and the independent use of reason to discover, what's intended by reading the map of the universe around us, so to speak. Ultimately, what happened, though, was that what came to triumph was the Asharite form of theology. We're talking in Sunni Islam, majoritarian Islam. The net result of which was a very strong influence on what I would call divine voluntarism. Okay, with the idea being basically that you have to be very careful about the use of human reason, much more emphasis on obedience. And as the Quran itself says, obey Allah, obey the Prophet, and obey those who have been put in authority over you. And the caliphs liked that very much. Yeah, so there really has not been as much room. There have been some attempts to try to revive it, but those have met with considerable resistance. Yes, ma'am.
We don't consider Mormons to be Christians, how we say, we don't recognize their baptism, but even so, they take the Old Testament and the New Testament and then add their own Book of Mormon on top of it. If Islam takes so much from the Old Testament, where a lot of these religious figures have no other script that recognizes them, then why don't they accept the Old Testament as a source of theological tradition? Yeah,
well, here you come upon a doctrine of tahrif. Okay, in other words, your question is addressed by that, which means distortion. Okay, in other words, tahrif says that you have to make a distinction between what's called scripture-bearing prophets and non-scripture-bearing prophets. Most of the prophets, according to Islam, most of the prophets did not come with a scripture, okay? But certain ones did. The higher-ranking ones came with it. So Islam says that unto Moses was revealed the Torah, okay? Unto Jesus was revealed the Injil, the word Injil is an example of a term in the Quran that comes from another language, evangelion. Okay? So unto Moses was revealed the Torah, unto Jesus was revealed the Injil, unto Muhammad was revealed the Quran. Okay? The problem is, according to the doctrine of Tahrif, is that the reason why the Quran is necessary is because, I talked about corruption before, the corruption is not just in belief, idolatrous, worshiping the golden calf, idolatrous Trinitarianism. The scriptures themselves were corrupted. And so today, it's very interesting. I have met Muslims who have said, yeah, I'm willing to look at the Bible, but a lot of Muslims are very, very leery of doing that because of the taint of corruption that surrounds it.
So they take part of it to be historical fact, like the golden calf is only recorded in the Bible.
But it's in the Quran.
So if it's transcribed into the Quran, then it is authentic.
Well, here's the thing. You have to keep in mind the fact that from the point of view of Islam, the Quran predates the Bible, right? Because remember we said that the Quran is the eternal, uncreated word of Allah, okay? And in the Hadith tradition, we haven't even gotten to Hadith. Hadith are sayings of Muhammad that are not in the Quran, okay? Right? So according to the Hadith tradition, from before all time, the text of the Quran has existed on what's called the Loh Mahfuz, the preserved tablet. So the Quran refers to Allah's throne. Right beside the throne is the Loh Mahfuz, the preserved tablet. All the words of the Quran have been there from all time. So in the year 610, when the Da'wah began, when the angel Gabriel appeared to Muhammad, remember in the cave? All Gabriel did was he scanned the relevant verses from the Quran, descended to heaven, descended to earth, and told Muhammad what to say. Muhammad, according to Islam, Muhammad is not the author of the Quran, right? According to Islam, Muhammad is not the author of the Quran. He's the recipient of it, right? So that's why the word for revelation in Arabic is tanzil, which means to bring something from on high down below. Yeah, good. Yes, sir.
Given that they see themselves as going back to the beginning and purifying the Judaic and Christian tradition, given that they reject the divinity of Christ, they reject the death of Christ on the cross, which they saved us, they reject the Trinity, what are the chances that Muhammad hit the nail on the head when he came to his wife originally and said, a demon appeared to me and it terrified the dickens out of him? What are the chances that it really was a demon? Because he had to be talked out of that, did he not?
Right. Yes, exactly. As I mentioned before, there are many, many points of discussion that I just touched on lightly. And it's in the book, too. But let me say something by way of spoiler, okay? The early Meccan revelations in the Quran, because that chronologically the earlier verses are Meccan, the later ones are Medinan. What's interesting is there are numerous references in the early Meccan verses saying to Muhammad, because remember that the Quran is regarded as Allah's revelations or reassurances to Muhammad, and a number of times in the early Meccan verses, there are references, statements that, no, Muhammad, you're not Majnun. You're not Majnun. Now, Majnun means possessed by a jinn. Remember we talked about the jinns, right? These demonic spirits. And I didn't have a chance to talk about this during the presentation, but there was a belief during the Jahiliyyah that the jinn were capable of entering into, they would take the initiative to enter into a relationship with an individual human being, right? And take possession of them, so to speak. Or that's the word that we use loosely. It basically means entering into a long-term relationship with that person. And that person would be said to be Majnun, okay? Possessed by a jinn. And when the interesting thing is that many of the early poets, the tribal poets, were said to have relations with jinns. In other words, the word for poet in early Arabic is sha'a, which literally means someone who has perceptions of the unseen realm. So the idea was that to be able to compose like that, hundreds of verses spontaneously, right? Think of Homer in the ancient Greek world, right? That oral recitation. And these are the vehicle to personal immortality. Your reputation encoded in a poem. That's power. That's real power. So, and it was believed that that was more than human, right? Right? And the Quran recognizes the existence of jinns. As I mentioned, chapter 72 of the Quran is called the jinn, okay? So, in other words, but they were also amoral, capricious, unpredictable. Muhammad did not want to think that he was possessed by a jinn, but he was worried that he did. In fact, if you look at the earliest Muslim biography, he was so scared that he had become Majnun, right, that he was tempted to throw himself from the top of Mount Hira, right? It's sort of like the end of the Exorcist kind of movie, right? You know what I'm saying, right? Okay, that kind of thing. So you're asking a very, very perceptive question, right? He was worried that, in fact, he was possessed by a jinn, and gradually he felt himself reassured that he wasn't. And as you mentioned, his wife Khadija, reassures him that he's not. So, and that's something, of course, that in Christian apologetics, people bring that out as a question. The only thing that I would say to those of you who engage in apologetics is Muslims don't tend to be really happy at that line of inquiry. But yeah, you can look in the sources and see exactly what you're talking about. And as I mentioned, I go over the sources and translate them.
Some of them abandoned Islam when they discovered that the Quran is not an uncorrupted, unaltered text, and when they discover things about Muhammad's life that they were not taught as children.
Yeah, so the interesting thing is, and the very interesting line of inquiry here, as adults, inquiring Muslims will sometimes come upon things that they were never exposed to as children. In my personal experience, okay, especially in Indonesia, Indonesia is an unusual Muslim country because it's not illegal to become a Christian. What is illegal is to proselytize, okay? But that has left more leeway for individual Muslims to approach me, privately, to talk about Christianity. And I don't go out, saying, hey, become a Christian, that kind of thing. I mean, it's illegal for one thing. But, St. Francis, I think, is very wise when he says, preach the gospel at all times. When necessary, use words. In other words, the idea is, by the way you live, you attract people. And then the opportunity perhaps for private conversation comes up. You have to be very aware of that in the Islamic world, okay? But what I want to say is that what's interesting, in my personal experience, people who move from Islam to Christianity, it is not so much over biographical points about Muhammad, but instead the overpowering experience of Christ's love. That's what wins people over. Yeah. Okay, good. Any other?
Maybe one more question?
Okay, one more question, yeah. Sir? Yeah.
Yes. How do Muslims pair usually the idea that the Quran is ungraded and has existed for all of time with the fact that it contains information about historical events like the crucifixion of Christ?
Right. Right, exactly. First of all, my responsibility as a speaker, of course, is to let you know what the Islamic doctrine is, okay, right? And in fact, there are a number of what I call problematic aspects of the Quran that, for me at least, make me simply disavow or reject doctrines like that, okay? This is where the emphasis in Islamic theology on divine voluntarism comes up. In other words, in Arabic, there's the expression "hada maktub." This has been written, to mean a fatalistic predetermination. And I would say predeterminism is culturally is much stronger in the Islamic and especially in the Arab world. So, in other words, the idea is that the reason why you have historically contingent events mentioned in the Quran is because of the fact that all of that had been predetermined with the foreknowledge of Allah. That's the shortest answer I can give. I guess we have to.
Well,
Yeah.
thank you very much.
That's good.